Welcome, ladies. Today is Saturday. We are in the middle of the weekend, and we are also in the middle of the 11th reset of 9.1. And what we are going to be doing today is the same thing we did last week, this time around, which is the weekly overview and review of how the raid has been going. What we have to go over today is something very interesting, very peculiar, and someone will need to answer for this. Either me or maybe you, but there will need to be an answer. There will need to be a solution to this puzzle. So as we go over the raid week by week, there are going to be less and less changes because things are stabilizing over time. So there's not going to be any type of surprise, out of nowhere scoop about a hidden spec suddenly turning OP. Most of the things have already been solved this tier, so the next time we will have to look at a clusterfuck of changes is likely going to be when 9.1.5 hits. Both the balance tuning and the multi-covenant spec drifting will allow people to try multiple things, diverse things, so we will be able to see many new things there, but for now, most of the things are going to stabilize and remain most of the same. So the thing in question when we look at the popularity, the tank and the healers as usually are still the same, so we won't spend time going over them. Brewmaster and Blood DK are now the default most popular couple of tanks, and when it comes to healers, once again, Resto Shaman and Holy Paladin are the most popular. The only slight change is when it comes to DPS is the same thing we were looking at last week. What we were looking at last week was the rising popularity of Fire Mage and the rising popularity of Beast Mastery Hunter. So, this is the week where finally we see Beast Mastery passing Marksmanship. The prediction was correct, not that it was hard to guess. If you looked at the trend of Beast Mastery Hunters, now they are being played more than Marksmanship. The other thing we were looking over was Fire, who just passed Arcane Mage last week, and this week they have gotten even further ahead. They passed more specs, and now they are getting closer to Frost Mage. Again, given the trend, in a couple of resets, Fire Mage should be the most played mage spec once again. I still think it's because of the reason I gave initially, which is the fact that after Fire was nerfed, everyone fled to Frost and Arcane, hoping that at least one of them would become flavor of the month, super strong, OP, must-have type of spec in a raid, much like mage specs have been for a long time in the game. Unfortunately, it did not turn out to be like that. This tier mages have not been particularly strong, so people seem to just be going back to Fire because they just like it more than Frost and Arcane. At the very least, it's more enjoyable for them to play. I think that's the reason why, but that is the main course when it comes to the popularity. Those are the main changes. The rest has remained roughly the same. It has kept going roughly the same. What I was talking about, however, that it would have been interesting to go over, to analyze this week. Last week we went to take a look at the deaths, right? The difference in the deaths now that we had more and more weeks of data available. How are the specs dying? Who is dying the most? Which are the hardest bosses in terms of deaths and in terms of wipe percentages, etc., etc. This week we are looking at something different, but equally interesting. To me, actually, it's more interesting, which is this one right here. So follow me with the reasoning, okay? We start in Castle Nathria and we look at the popularity, okay? We see that Marksmanship Hunter, Fire Mage, Balance Druid, Unholy, Affliction, Shadow Priest, Outlaw, Fury, even Windwalker, those are all, at the top of the popularity. So these are the specs that are being played the most, okay? And then we go and look at their performance. So how are the specs performing in Castle Nathria? And this is the result. You see the top of Castle Nathria was Balance, Affliction, Fire, Unholy, Shadow, Windwalker, Marksmanship, which were basically the specs that were being played the most. And you might tell me, Eisen, yeah, that is what happens. People play a spec a lot because it is strong. So if you see people playing these specs, it must be because they're doing good, because they're doing well. So this is how it looked in Castle Nathria, okay? The green specs being the most popular specs who are also performing well, and the red spec, in this case only one, Fury Warrior, which is one of the most popular specs who is not performing as well. So this is how it looked in Castle Nathria. But before revealing the Sanctum of Domination situation, we have to drive the point even harder. This was Battle of the Zara lore in BFA. So all of the specs that were the most popular were pretty much high up. They were confirming their popularity by doing very well. You had a few outliers here and there, Fury Warrior, Frost Mage, and BM Hunter as well, but for the most part it was representative of the popularity of the specs. You go over to Eternal Palace, and this time it's even cleaner. This time there are even less, outliers, even less unique changes. It's mostly one-to-one. The most popular specs are the ones that are doing the best in the raid. And then we finish with Nyalotha, where 4 of the top 5 performing specs are all of the most popular ones. So now it's time to move to Sanctum of Domination. When we look at Sanctum of Domination, when it comes to the popularity of the specs, you have Balanced Druid, Arms, Havoc, Beast Mastery and Marksmanship Hunters, Destruction, Shadow, Frost, and Unholy. Now, this is the performance that we have this week of the DPS specs. Now, to make it clearer, to just pinpoint the situation much better, the situation looks like this. We have a reverse situation where all of the most popular specs, with the exception of one, Arms Warrior, so all of the other most popular specs are also the worst performing specs in the raid. Not just a few of them, not just a few outliers like we saw in previous raid tiers, like all of them. And not just, towards the middle of the pack, somewhat disappointing, like Havoc or like Marksmanship. No, like the actual bottom. Destruction and Frost Mage, for example, are the 4th and 6th most popular range DPS specs, and they are the worst and 2nd worst performing range spec in the game. You have Unholy, who is the 3rd most popular melee spec, who is also the 2nd worst performing melee DPS spec. And then, of course, conversely, at the top, you have much less popular specs, because outside of Arms, which we have pointed out as the outlier, you have something like Subrogue, which is in the middle of the pack when it comes to popularity. You have something like Feral Druid, which is the 4th least played spec in raids. You have something like Outlaw Rogue, which is the 5th least played spec in the raid, and Affliction, which is the 3rd least played of all specs, of all DPS specs in the raid. To put things in perspective, if you put together all of the players that have been playing Subtlety, plus the ones playing Feral, plus the ones playing Outlaw, and the ones playing Affliction, you still wouldn't make up the players that play Balanced Druid, for example. And this is the question that needs to be answered today. Why? Why is this happening? And more importantly, maybe this is something common. Maybe this happens every time, so there is an answer already. But this doesn't happen every time. We just looked at it. In BOD, in Eternal Palace, in Nyalotha, and in Castle Nathria, this did not happen. This is the first time in recent memory that we have this type of switcheroo, where all of the most popular specs are not performing as well as they should, or at the very least as their popularity would suggest. So I can give you my initial explanation, my logical conclusion that I went to by looking at these specs. My logical explanation for this unexplainable phenomenon is that all of these specs that are at the bottom right now in performance but are very, very popular, the reason why they are very, very popular is because they have been popular for a while, or they were popular, very popular in the first season. They were popular in Castle Nathria. For example, if you look at Balanced Druid, Shadow Priest, Marksmanship Hunter, Unholy Death Knight, those were the most popular and the most played specs in Castle Nathria. So just up until a few months ago, those were the most popular. Then you take Fire Mage, which was the other most popular spec in Castle Nathria, which all went to respec Frost. And now Frost is one of the specs that are doing badly. You put Beast Mastery together with Marksmanship, because Beast Mastery players are simply Marksmanship players rerolling to Beast Mastery, so they are one and the same. And then you have Affliction, which was another one of the most popular specs in Castle Nathria, and the players rerolled to Destruction. So my logical explanation for this is that these were simply the specs that players were playing in Castle Nathria, and then they continued to play them. At best, they rerolled within the same class. So the Fire Mage is going Frost, the Affliction Warlocks going Destruction or the Marksmanship Hunters going Beast Mastery, but they remained still there, still in the same class, and then they went into Sanctum of Domination with that. So even if the specs are doing badly, those were the popular specs, so people will be playing them. It's not that because Feral Druid is doing very well or because Rogues are doing very well, all of the unholy DKs are going to reroll to Rogue at the start of 9.1. So that, to me, seems to be the most logical explanation as to why this is happening. People made the choice of what to play at the start of the expansion. It paid off for these specs in particular, most of these specs, at the start of Castle Nathria. Maybe even people chose these specs because they assumed, they thought, they read online, they watched videos online, and they decided to play Unholy or Fire Mage, for example, because they were very strong, maybe Marksmanship Hunter as well. And this carried on for most of Castle Nathria, but by the start of Sanctum of Domination, things changed. They went not too much for the better for many of these specs, but these people were playing them already. They were playing the specs already, so they are continuing to do so now as well, even though the performance is not really as good as it was compared to Castle Nathria. That seems to be the most logical explanation for this phenomenon, which is very, very unique. The other explanation, which is a little bit more performance related, is because of the types of damage you can do in the fights. In Sanctum of Domination, you have very, very good results if you have good AoE, like Soul Render, like Painsmith, like Fate Scribe and Kel'Thuzad, and then you can also do very good single target in some other fights, like Guardian and like Sylvanas. So the result is that if you're very well equipped for one of these two tools, for one of these two profiles, either AoE or single target, you can do very well. If we see at the top, for example, Subtlety Rogue is very good in single target, Outlaw, Assassination are also very good in single target, Windwalker is the best in AoE, you have Affliction and Elemental, who are the second best in AoE, and they are all showing up well in the performance. And then you look at the hybrids, you look at the Jack of all trades, you look at the I have good damage profiles in sort of everything, and this results in them not doing as well overall. Because, for example, Balanced Druid doesn't have excellent AoE and doesn't have excellent single target. They have excellent burst single target with their Ravenous Frenzy, etc., but overall it's not spectacular. It doesn't show up in the meters when you look at the overall numbers. You have Shadow Priest, which also isn't excelling in anything. You have BM Hunter, Unholy Death Knight, Frost Mage. These specs don't have a very special, unique niche where they are at the top. So it might be harder for them to shine when you look at the overall numbers, when you look at the overall DPS that they do, comprising all the bosses of the raid. Either way, whichever answer might be the true one, I thought it was very interesting that we find ourselves in this very bizarre situation where the top specs aren't actually the top specs, and the bullied, underplayed, niche and hipster specs, many of them are currently doing very well. From Elemental to Windwalker to Feral to even Demonology, which I always like when Demonology is doing well. All of these specs right now are doing much better than all of the very popular specs, which is a very unique and funny, to me at least, situation. Not much else to look this week when it comes to the raid. We went over the popularity, and we will continue to look at how it progresses. The performance remains in line with what the bosses want you to do. We can still look, since we just talked about the single target, we can still look at Guardian of the First Ones for our single target dummy boss fight, where we see what we just pointed out, that all of these super popular specs are towards the bottom half. The only exception in here is Shadow Priest. All the others, Frost Mage, Destruction, Marksmanship, Unholy, BM Hunter are all towards the bottom. Even Havoc and Balanced Druid are in the middle. So when it comes to single target, these specs are not doing very well. Okay, fine. What about massive AoE? Like Soul Render, Shadow Priest, Destruction, Unholy, Frost Mage, BM Hunter, again at the bottom. Havoc and Balanced Druid again in the middle. They are not excelling in pure single target, they are not excelling in very heavy AoE, and these bosses show you the results. The other explanation to close the video is that I will remind everyone every time we go through this, a lot of this damage doesn't matter, okay? When you look at Kel'Thuzad, for example, once again, we see that the top DPS specs are the ones that do very good AoE, and that are not in the most played specs. We have Elemental, Affliction, we have Windwalker, once again at the top for AoE, and once again we have the very popular specs like Beast Mastery, like Balance, like Unholy, like Shadow Priest, like Frost Mage, all towards the bottom. But many of these fights do not really have very important AoE. The AoE you are doing on Kel'Thuzad is mostly useless. It's not something that is going to be a make or break the raid. It's not something your spec needs to talent for. It needs to set up a legendary for to do more AoE. It's just some accidental padding damage you have to do in the fight, which is going to show up in the meters. It's going to show up in the overall damage, but is not very important. For example, since we are talking on Kel'Thuzad, the Ravenous Frenzy cooldown single target damage that you can do as a balanced druid in the Phylactery, in the intermission phase, is much more important than having good AoE. You would easily trade triple balanced druid to send down in the Phylactery over having 3 of the top DPSers on Kel'Thuzad, which are Elemental, Affliction and Windwalker. Because the Phylactery and not having enough damage is what can wipe you, whereas lacking AoE damage on the adds is basically never going to happen and is never going to wipe your raid. So the importance of that damage is not going to show up in the meters. It's going to show that Balanced Druid is the 5th worst DPS on Kel'Thuzad, but the reality is different. It's much more important than that, which might also be why some of these specs continue to be played a lot, even though their performance in the overall meters doesn't seem to be great at the moment. Anyways, these were my possible answers, my possible solutions as to why this is happening to the most popular specs right now. Let me guys know what's yours. Let me guys know what's the possible reason as to why all of these popular specs are not showing up too well so far in the overall performance in the raid. Thank you anyways for watching the video. If you want to support the channel, you can leave a like, you can order me some pizza, subscribe to the channel and comment down below. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, no weird as fuck toppings on the pizza, okay? No pineapple, no fruits or weird shit like that, okay?